This is a quick dissection of an application I made as part of the LudumDare Compo event. The LudumDare Compo is a biannual event in which a single developer creates a game in 48 hours from scratch. This was my first attempt at any such event. I did finish the game itself, and I was able to place in the top 100 in a couple of the categories. You're graded on about 5 different categories in an overall score. 4,900 people participated and submitted a game at the end, so I'm very happy with how things turned out. We're going to dive right into the application itself. So the application is a Vue.js application, and that's it. That's all the technology that's really involved here. My original plan was to have a Vue.js application as a single-page application, a couple of endpoints served by AWS's Lambda and powered by Go under the hood, and then DynamoDB as a simple database for state management. 4 hours into the event, it becomes very obvious what you can and can't accomplish during that time. I was in charge and had to create all of my own assets. And with that in mind, it became apparent that I was going to need to cut something out or cut something down, whether it be my ideas for the game or the tech I chose. With that in mind, I completely cut out Go and serverless functions, as well as DynamoDB for state management, and really pared down what I was going to do. Under the hood, this entire game is run by Vue. It's very simple. You choose your date to start off with. You can already tell something's a little funky because it's saying, you know, you're dating a monster. This was kind of a scary little lamp over here. We're going to go ahead and choose Melinda to date first. It's very simple. You have Melinda over here. You have a conversation chain. You go through, choose a part of that conversation, and then you see that conversation happen in real time. And it's a little bit random. You don't know what you're going to say at any other time, and you don't know how they're going to react. Each piece you add to this changes the end game and also changes how this individual looks over here. You can see that we have a red square, hasn't changed much. Let's add another red square here. Let's see. Now we've got 2 red things. Remember the name Puzzled and Dating a Monster, and we can see that our date is suddenly becoming more like a monster as we go through. Towards the end of the game, and we can actually skip forward to the end, and I'll show you why that's possible in just a little bit. But we're going to go ahead and skip to the end of the game, in which, depending on how well you did on that date, you get a few different endings. Some of them are happier than others. You know, you got their phone number, or I want to do a -10 here. Or you actually went to Vegas and got married. You did get divorced next day, but again, still a happy ending. There's, I want to say, 5 or 6 different endings. Each of them have their own art assets. Throughout the game, there is different music for each part, in the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. And those songs were, again, created by me in 48 hours with a couple of different applications. Let's go ahead and dive into the code, because I think that's some of the most important aspects of this whole project. This was the only Vue.js game that I saw submitted. A lot of people were submitting in lower level languages or using things like, it was an 8-bit arcade maker. So it was a little unique in the fact that I don't think anyone else built a single page application and turned it into a game. And so I didn't have much else to go on. I don't know of anyone that really paved the way here. I chose Vue, and I chose the Vue CLI to handle all of the bootstrapping of the actual Vue application. The reason for this being is you have 48 hours. Bootstrapping is the last thing you want to worry about if possible. Vue.js, or the Vue CLI, made it possible for me to, again, have a very simple framework, have a lot of the modules already needed, have the layout framework in the form of Element UI under the hood ready to go, and to do the simplest things like mounting the application, having a simple, the original Vue component that initializes a router, the inclusion of said router. It really saved me a lot of time and let me focus on the game and the assets. The assets took the majority of the time, and with that being the case, I had to be very careful in what I took on as part of the actual programming task itself. So let's go ahead and dive back into the title screen. If we go to the router, we only have 3 routes. We have the title route, we have the conversation route, and we have the ending route. And what's interesting is that you can skip ahead to any of these routes and any of the states that are possible with those routes. So if, for example, we go to the ending, you can see, all right, we're going to the ending, and we're going to tell it which ending basically to give us. So, hey, we gave it the ending. The reason for this is that I didn't include any kind of application state management. I didn't use Vuex, which is kind of like Redux for React. Chose to completely disregard that. Because of that, I made some easy choices on how to handle state via query parameters. For example, we're passing in how badly our date went into the end of the application itself. If we choose to date Melinda, we actually tell it what date we're going to choose when we get to this conversation screen. And that decides a lot of what happens. If we dive into the title very quickly, this is the actual component here. And let me go ahead and hide that so we can see the code just a little bit better. This is a library called Vue.typer. This handled the original, not the original, but the typing animation here. Very, very, very simple. All told, there's 111 lines of code. Still feels like a little too much for what I wanted to do. A lot of it, honestly, is just framework, and I like my spacing to be a little bit, maybe excessive is the right kind of word. Very simple. This was an interesting one. So each of those buttons that we saw up here, this is Vue's transition, which is a built-in function of Vue that allows things like a fade-in of certain components. Each of these components, those buttons, simply calls a method called next with the name of our date. So if we look at the method called next, all the method called next does is it fades out the title song which I created and then takes us to the conversation path of the router and the query of which date we chose. So if we again go to the conversation path, and there's the query, our date. This was an interesting bug I ran into with regards to the title song. I used a library called Howl to handle the playing of the music in the background. However, with Howl, and this wasn't readily apparent in the documentation, if you did not navigate away from the entire site, you could go however many pages in and still hear that song playing in the background. And so I'd have about 4 songs going by the time I got to this page, and I could not figure out for the life of me how to stop it if it was a browser-only issue. So I spent more time than I'm willing to admit trying to debug this particular one. Once we've selected a date, we pass that into the conversation component. So if we run back into the router here, we're calling the conversation path, calls out to the conversation component, and this is where the majority of the magic happens. This component here is what controls what's on the left-hand side of the screen. And I don't know. Yeah, this is what controls the left-hand side of the screen. I'm sorry, I was trying to see if my mouse was showing up correctly on the video, and I don't believe it is. And so this component is dynamic in the fact that we say component, but we actually tell it what component to pick out. And it's based on the name of the date. So if we drive down here, we can see that the component we choose, oh, sorry, here we go, is the name of our date. and it imports two separate components. And here are our two separate components, Melinda and Robert. These components are extremely simple. We pass in the name of obviously which of those components to choose, and we tell it how close to being a monster or to being happy this individual is. So for example, if we choose this horrible conversation piece about my mother, we are telling this component, hey, our monster level, which is basically the state management of this conversation, is very high. Go ahead and do whatever it is you do when that monster level is high. And let's dive back into the code so you can see what I mean by the monster level. There is a single piece of state management in this. Okay, single piece is the wrong word, but there's a single piece of really important state management that doesn't control things like the modal selection or what pieces are selected, and that is the monster level. The monster level is an integer that the higher the integer is, the closer the individual is to becoming a monster. The lower the integer is, and going into the negative determines how much of a nice person they are. And there are different animations for each individual level of that person. If we dive a little bit in, and this is an excellent example, I think, of something I threw out the window. The conversation pieces, this is extremely simple, and in a real life application, I would never do this. I would like the ability to obviously add and remove from these conversation pieces as I see fit, as well as to make them completely different. If we dive into the conversation piece, I'm sorry, the utils folder here. All the conversation piece is a massive JSON file. It tells you what Robert's reaction is to a conversation piece, what Melinda's reaction is to a monster piece, how much the delay is on the typing before the OK sign appears. So right here, some of these have a longer delay because they are longer conversation pieces. And then the monster level. Does this, the increment, should we increment by 0, increment by 1, -4, so we decrement 10 from the monster level, all controlled by a single JSON folder. So if JSON file, if I change any of these, it changes these conversation pieces that we're seeing on the side. So with that in mind, let's run back into the conversation piece here. Again, we only have a few different methods. We have the open conversation method, in which we pass it a piece, which is one of these. What it does is it brings up the dialogue option, it brings up the conversations, and it actually plays a couple of songs. Reply, this one again chooses what reply to use from our JSON file and then type that in. To close the conversation, this is what handles the button here. This actually also what handles the inclusion of this conversation piece into the conversation chain. So if I was able to skip past this and hit the X before all that happened, obviously this wouldn't do anything. The actual monster piece would not show. And then the finishing method, which happens at the end of all of this. Again, we fade out whatever song's playing. We start the ending song, and we send someone into the ending path. And remember, I was talking about the query parameters. So we take that monster level, which is the most important piece of state, and we send them into the ending path, which is, again, simply ending, and the query parameter, which tells us what monster level this individual is at. Now, based on this monster level, our endings change. So technically, from the title screen, you could skip all the way to the ending screen, and the game would not know the difference. And that's just something, oops, that was simplistic about it. So again, drove to Vegas and got married because we changed the monster level down to a very low option. There are a lot of things, this is unused, but these kind of polished things aren't what somebody sees in the end application. I felt bad, and I still cringe when I see some of these unused classes or some of these inline CSS classes that I could have avoided. But nobody that actually plays the application or wants to use the application really cares. They only care about the game. And so the ending polish actually spent a lot more on these assets than I did on the original game. There's a couple of takeaways from the LudumDare that I'd like to run over really quickly before the end. The first being is that don't make unnecessary work for yourself. Don't write a library from scratch if you don't need to. Don't take on pieces of technology like Redux or Vuex for state management when doing something as simple as a query parameter or keeping everything within a same component could work. Do use as many frameworks as possible, as many outside libraries as possible, and take the time to run the tweaks for those to make them look good and work with your game. The second biggest takeaway I brought from this event was the fact that you need to know your tools going into this a lot better than I did mine. I had actually chosen a fairly new tool for the pixel art creation as well as the music creation. I knew my editor very well. I was using Vim at the time. However, the plugin I used for Vue and Vim was something I was not terribly familiar with. So about halfway through, I actually threw Vim out, pulled in IntelliJ, installed their Vue component, and just dealt with an editor that I wasn't terribly fond of, simply because the options and functionality it allowed for Vue made my job a lot easier. Know the tools you're using and know them well before you're forced to use them under a deadline. All in all, this is a fantastic event. I recommend that every developer try it at least once. Everyone has the skills to do this. If you only ever have made an API or made some backend services, you can do something like a CLI game, something like Zork at the end of the day. If you've only ever done web development or front-end spas, you could do something like this very, very simply. I highly recommend it. I love it, and I definitely will do it again. Thanks for listening to this dissection. There's a couple other dissections on the site for a couple of my other apps. I recommend that you go listen to each one. I try to focus on different pieces, not only the tech in each one. So thank you.